Okay, so this week we have a double parasha, Matot-Mas'ei. We will focus on the beginning of the second parasha, that is Parashat Mas'ei. Parashat Mas'ei is exactly as it sounds, or at least the first half of the parasha is about the Masa'ot, the journeys that Am Yisrael took. The Torah famously lists all 42 journeys that Am Yisrael engaged in from Yetziat Mitzrayim and until their entrance after Moshe Rabbeinu's death, under the leadership of Yeshua ben Nun, their entrance to Eretz Yisrael. A total of 42 journeys. Rashi right away points out that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not cause them to move as much as it would seem by that number of 42. For the first 14 journeys were in the first year, and the last 8 journeys were in the final year. And that leaves you with 20 journeys in the 38 years that are, so to speak, in the middle. And so therefore, it's really a chesed, you can say, by HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the minimal amount of journeys, you can say, that they had to engage in. So we're going to soon display a very important, the first few Pesukim of the parasha, but let us just talk about this idea of the Torah enumerating these travels. What is the purpose? Most of these are places that we have not heard of up until this point in the Torah. There seem to be not eventful. They seem, most of them, to have very little to no significance to us. A few of them, the Torah connects to the events which took place in that location, and otherwise, they don't seem to be significant. So what is then the significance, and what is the objective of the Torah in enumerating and listing these 42 travels and journeys? So we know that there are, if you read through the Mefarshim on this parasha, there's a plethora of different theories and approaches by the commentaries as to the purposes of these journeys, and they can all coexist. But I would like to pick some of the theories that I would say are not only a great explanation of why the Torah listed the journeys, but also show really a profound connection to the historical journeys of the desert and to concepts that are existing and present in the history of Am Yisrael, and especially the Jewish people in exile, which we've been now for most of our history. Those are the theories that I want to present today. I'll say 4 of them, but the third will be the main one. The first one is the Sforno. Sforno says that the reason for listing the travels is to show Bnei Yisrael's unbelievable commitment and devotion to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They followed him. As soon as the cloud moved, they followed him blindly into the desert. Wherever he said, run, and they said, how fast? And that's a praise to Am Yisrael. So this list, therefore, is praising the accolades of the nation. And we can certainly say that in the history of Am Yisrael, that we deserve a pat on the back, and that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, has really directed us, you can say, to so many places over the centuries, in so many different circumstances, and at least for the observant, devout, Yireh Shamayim, traditional communities, which over history, maybe you can say most of them were, certainly they remained devoted and committed to God and the Torah and the principles of Judaism. And that is a very obvious connection then between the desert travels and our travels of exile. Second is the one brought in Moreh Nebuchim. Maybe this is the most well-known. The Rambam in Moreh Nebuchim, and this is quoted by the Ramban and others as well, speaks about the listing of the journeys. And he says the reason why Hashem saw this necessary is so that one should not think for a moment that these sojourns and travels of Am Yisrael over the course of these 40 years were in places that were close to civilization, that it was land that was somewhat fertile, that they had access to water. One should not be mistaken to think that they had to travel in locations that one had any natural means of survival. And so we map out geographically for us where exactly were these areas. And when we look at the geographical landscape, we realize that, goodness gracious, these are places that have absolutely zero in terms of vegetation, in terms of water, in terms of normal conditions, weather conditions that a person would be able to survive. And yet, HaKadosh Baruch Hu saw to it that we did survive. And as we read later on in Parashat Eikev, the book of Devarim, Moshe Rabbeinu recalled to us and to the people that he took us through Hamolich Harab, Hamidbar, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vehanora, Nahash, Raf, Akrab, Simaon, Asher, and Shamayim, barren places, places that were dangerous, places that had no water. And yet, in the book of Yirmiyah, in the Matot-Mas'ei, also describes similarly these dangerous, barren places that there's no logical reason to say that people can survive. One person would have difficulty surviving a day or more in such an area, and yet millions of people survived for years in such places. 40 years, almost 40 years. And so these journeys really are praise to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Listing them shows us that we had no business surviving, and yet God miraculously held us in his compassionate hand and basically furnished our existence. And likewise, if we contemplate in our long, difficult exile, the places that we've been over centuries and millennia, the way in which we have been everywhere, every place, under the most brutal, oppressive situations, with empires, regimes, and countries wanting to wipe us out. And we have survived in against all odds, unexplainable, inexplicable manner, in what we can only explain as a miraculous state of existence of Am Yisrael throughout the centuries, a phenomenon that the Gentiles have, in an awe-inspiring way, took notice of. And in that manner, there is a profound connection between the purpose of listing these journeys in the desert and our journey throughout the course of our exile. Miraculous, just nothing short of a miraculous existence that we've had, difficult, but through the hand of God, something that is not explainable otherwise in any natural way throughout the course of our centuries of suffering in the exile. And that is a wonderful connection. However, the one that I want to focus on is really Rashi's theory and based on a Midrash Tanchuma. And Rashi provides us with this well-known mashal, an analogy of a king who had a sick son, and he brought him and he cared for him and he held him over difficult terrain and very hard circumstances, and the son eventually was brought back to health and survived. And then later, the father toured him, his father toured him around the areas that they had passed when he was sick. And he said, here's where I cooled you off, and here's where I fed you, and here's where I tended to this need of yours, etc. And that's it. And the truth is that the analogy is, it's a little cryptic because it doesn't really explain to us clearly and exactly the purpose for these listing of the travels and the different trips that HaKadosh Baruch Hu took us through the course of the years of the desert. So really, to understand that difficulty and explain that midrash that Rashi brings down, we need to look at the Pesukim that begin our parasha and point out a few of the difficulties. So we'll now display those Pesukim to you. Here they are, the desert travels, which is the beginning of Matot-Mas'ei, just 2 Pesukim. And we're going to notice some very obvious issues. So the parasha begins, Matot-Mas'ei b'nei Israel. These are the travels, the sojourns, the journeys of Am Yisrael, Asher Yasu Me'es Mitzrayim Sibotam Biyad Moshe v'Aharon, who left Egypt in their legions and their masses of people by the leadership of Moshe and Aharon. And here are the following travels in which they engaged after that time. And here's Pasuk Bet, the other introductory Pasuk, with difficulties. Vayichtov Moshe et Mosa'ehem lemas'ehem api Adonai. Ve'ela mas'ehem le'mosa'ehem. So the word Mosa'ehem, we can simply translate as their laset, to exit, or exodus. So their exodus, or the exits, the following are their exits, lemas'ehem, which led to their journeys or their travels by the mouth or the command of God. And ve'ele, and these are, so Moshe wrote them down, and these are the journeys, lemosa'ehem, to the places which they exited. Obvious, glaring question is, why does, in the same pasuk, the Torah reverse the order? First it says, mosa'ehem, lemasa'ehem, their exits to their travels. And then it says, that's when Moshe wrote them down. And then it says, and these are, and it says first the word mas'ehem, their travels to the places or from the places that they exited. And I put, for that same reason, those words in the same colors. The first word mas'eh, mas'ehem in blue, mosa'ehem in green. But you see, the order is switched. Moshe wrote mosa'ehem lemas'ehem, exits to the travels, the journeys, and then these are travels or journeys lemosa'ehem, to the places that they exited. And the second question is, why only regarding what Moshe wrote is api Hashem, by the mouth or command of God, and then when they actually listed them, it doesn't say by the mouth of God. So we'll leave this here for a moment, and I want to present to you a perush of a less known but very meaningful and deep commentary on Chumash. It's called HaKetav HaKabbalah, written by an 18th century Ashkenazi Talmid Chacham. And he says the word here, mosa'ehem, does not mean what we think it means, which means exits. Rather, it's from the same root as the word when Moshe Rabbeinu told Yitro et kol ha'tela'a asher mesa'atam, which means the events that Am Yisrael were faced with. And so therefore, it says, Vayichtov Moshe Mosa'ehem, what Moshe Rabbeinu basically did is he kept a diary. And every single place, every new city, every new area that Hashem told them to go towards, he wrote Mosa'ehem. He wrote the events which took place in that journey, or in the place to which they journeyed. Mosa'ehem, the events, lemas'ehem, to the places that they traveled. And named the place, which didn't have a name apparently because no one else travels there, named the place to which they traveled after the event that took place. Vayichtov Moshe. So that's Moshe Rabbeinu's diary. He wrote Mosa'ehem, the events of the places to which they traveled. But when we actually list them, we speak about, of course, Mas'ehem, the places that they traveled to, and Mosa'ehem, the events that took place in those places. So that's the explanation of the exact wording over here. Let me take this off the screen for the time being. But how does that explain why the Torah lists these journeys? And the explanation is clear to me now, based on this perush of HaKetav HaKabbalah. And I want to first give you maybe a real life example. You know, everyone goes through difficulties in life. We should not know of them, but it's part of life. Financial difficulties, health difficulties, social difficulties, family difficulties, but mental difficulties, all types of problems that confront us in life. And as God-fearing Jews, as faithful Jews, as believing Jews, we always say it's from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We know it's the right thing. We believe in him. Everything he does is for the best. However, we're human beings, and we can't help question in the course, while we're in the midst of those challenges, did it have to be that way? Does it have to be like this? I mean, I worked so hard on this business. Why? The small whys linger in our mind. And the clarity is, on rare occasions, in rare people, shown and seen and revealed and realized in the moment or during the challenge or during the difficulty and the suffering of life. But the key word is reflection. Sometime later, the next day, the next month, a year, 10 years later in your life, when you reflect on that moment, that period of time of challenge and difficulty and suffering, clarity is much easier. It's so much easier to reflect and look at. I see. Perfect. Obvious. That's why it was done. It's had to be that way. It produced this in my life. It brought me to this point in my life. When we are able to reflect on the bigger picture, we see a tapestry of different events that seem to be difficult and hard to understand and to be not connected, now synthesized into this beautiful portrait that God painted that is the picture of our life. Only upon, in hindsight, in reflection, are we able to see and have clarity there. And that is exactly what HaKadosh Baruch Hu was doing in listing those 42 travels based on this explanation and telling us about the events that took place in each and every one of those locations, which at the time was very difficult for us. We suffered as a people. We didn't understand many of them. We complained many times. But in hindsight, when they were able to reflect on those 42 journeys afterwards, it all made sense. It made perfect sense. The portrait, the big picture came together as they reflected. And I think that this is possibly the most profound connection that we can make from the travels of Am Yisrael in the desert to our travels and existence in our difficult thousands of years of exile, because our nation has gone through tragedy upon tragedy, difficulty, suffering, oppression to no end, incomprehensible. Some of them are just too hard to explain, even in hindsight, but certainly when the Jews at the time were suffering, even the communities of faith asked why and had no answers. And now here we are, being able to reflect back so many years later, after the journeys were listed, so to speak, in exile and difficulty, and say, you know what? I can't connect all the dots and explain everything, but this makes a lot of sense. The fact that we lived there, the fact that we incurred that difficulty in that century, in that place, and look what that produced, and look how we continue to survive afterwards. The dots begin to connect. The picture and the portrait begins to come together in a more beautiful way. And you see that the events of our history now in hindsight begin to make sense. As we look to the grand plan of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we look at it when we reflect back in history. And that is a wonderful connection between the events listed in the 42 journeys in the desert and our journeys in Galut. But to be explained, which we haven't yet, is the other difficulty, which is Al Pi Hashem. Why is it, come back to the Pasuk now, that only regarding the ones that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote down, the events of the travels is saved by the mouth of God. And the Emek Davar says, if you look, you can divide the comments on travels into three. Here they are: Mas'ei B'nai Israel, Mosa'ahem L'Masa'ahem, and Mas'aim L'Mosa'ahem. And the Emek Davar says, remember those three categorizations of the 42 travels that Ashi mentioned? That's how they're categorized in these three Pesukim. Look, when we focus on Mas'ei travels, that's the first 14 in the first year of the desert. And again at the bottom, when we focus on Mas'ei travels, that's the last 8 in the final year of the desert. Those 22 travels were all focused on traveling to Israel, Eretz Yisrael. We were traveling with a goal. Therefore, it said Mas'ei first. The middle one, which is the 38 years, the 20 travel, we were just wandering around the desert. We traveled for the sake of traveling, for the sake of exiting. And therefore it says Musa'ahem first. Only those middle ones that seem to make no sense. We were wanderers in the desert with no direction, seeming aimlessly traveling around. Does it say Al Pi Hashem? By the mouth, by the command, by the guidance of God. Because only in the most difficult ones, the ones that make the least sense, in the desert, in exile, in life, we have to remind ourselves that they are Al Pi Hashem, that by the hand of God and with the caring, compassionate guidance of God, like the ones that do make sense to us, like the ones that seem to definitely have a purpose. And now, with that, I'll conclude with a last thought and a last theory on why Hashem, the Torah, lists the 42 journeys. And that is Rabbeinu Bachya. And he says that these 42 journeys are all hints towards the future, to future journeys of Am Yisrael and the future Geulah, the future redemption. Because just like we had to wander in the desert for 40 years until we were redeemed to Eretz Yisrael, we have to, and it has been decreed upon us, to wander in this long, arduous, difficult exile for so many centuries until we're redeemed to Eretz Yisrael. This is our desert, this exile. And based on that Perush, we can now only hope and pray, but really believe. Well, the first section of Mas'ei, the 14 travels we were going to Israel, that's over. That was in our first stays in Israel in the first and second Bet HaMikdash. The middle difficult period, those middle 20 journeys and those 38 years of the desert we were wandering around, we can only hope, but we really believe that they're coming to an end. That diary that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote down, the aimless journeys, Al Pi Hashem, where God guided us through the centuries and kept us and facilitated and perpetuated our existence, that they're coming to an end. And we are now, as we live in miraculous times, with the state of Israel, with miracles happening, with gathering the exiles and kibbutz galuyot, we're at the last leg, the last stage, the last year of the desert, the 8 journeys that now come back to Mas'ei. They're not aimless exitings, yet they are travels with a definite goal and objective to get to Eretz Yisrael. We now can really reflect, as Rabbeinu Bachya says in a very historical way. He lived over 800 years ago. We're talking about 21st century. Reflect in a historical way on the 3 stages of the journeys as described to Am Yisrael in the desert, and reflect on our journeys. And now say that perhaps that middle stage of aimless journeys is over. The diary is coming to a close now, where we wandered aimlessly in our exile, and we're up to the last leg, where we are back to Mas'ei, travels for a purpose, travels with an exact direction to get to Eretz Yisrael, and to live out the end of our desert travels and come to our days of redemption, our full Geulah Shelema with all Jews and Eretz Yisrael, and the coming of Mashiach b'mhera b'yamenu. Amen. An analysis on the 42 travels and the listing of them in Matot-Mas'ei. Shabbat Shalom.